So when I left here left Canada in 2001 to work in Central Africa, my job was to cover the conflict in Congo initially, but then I started working in places like Darfur in Sudan, um, covering Somali refugees coming to Kenya. This is again in South Sudan. And I would travel around and I would document hunger crises and famines, displaced populations. And one of the main stories that I covered over many years and was based in Congo and Rwanda, I've been talking with Alan about that over the last little while, was the conflict in Congo. And this is probably the main focus of my journalistic efforts for a number of years. The conflict in Congo has killed about 5 million people over the last 20 years, possibly more, making it the deadliest war since World War II. And my job was initially as a correspondent, but I moved gradually into photography as I discovered it as a way of telling stories from a part of the world that wasn't getting a huge amount of attention in the wake of 9/11, when much of the mainstream media focus was on the Middle East. And when 9/11 happened, I was actually on my way to my posting in Congo, and I thought maybe I should be going to Iraq or Afghanistan if I want to make my name as a journalist in this business. But then I thought about it and I realized that everybody will be going there, and all the best journalists will be going there. It'll be much more difficult for me to carve out a space for myself as a young and relatively inexperienced journalist. But there's this amazing story, or amazing stories, to be told from this part of the world, and very few people were doing it. And so I stuck with this plan and spent the next decade documenting Congo and the various other conflicts around. One of the things from a journalistic standpoint that wasn't necessarily standard practice, certainly among the newswires, was to identify people by name and by age and so on. So I made it my practice, coming from a journalistic background, to always do that. All of these photographs, to have everybody's name, their age. And for me, that was an important thing to do, because it's very easy for the coverage of a place like West or Central Africa, or the continent as a whole, even though it's far from being a homogeneic entity, is just to photograph and say African refugee or soldier or whatever it might be, without really giving a sense that it's not just another statistic, that it's actually an individual with a story and a life. And by providing the name and the background to each person, it really allows people on another side of the world an ability to identify in some way with who this person is. The other thing, we talk about conflict photography, we talk about war photography or combat photography. I don't really consider myself to be any of those things. I'm a photographer. One of the things I cover is war. One of the things is conflict. But I would always look to cover stories that were a little bit unusual, that you wouldn't expect to find. And this is a story I did in South Africa ahead of the World Cup in 2010. And I was tasked with going and doing features from this country that was, in a way, a post-conflict society living in the aftermath of apartheid. We know a great deal about the disenfranchisement of the black population in South Africa. But there's this weird thing as well about poor white South Africans, who make up a much smaller portion of the population. But the background is that this demographic is actually what apartheid was created to protect. And now they found themselves on the wrong side of history. There's no longer a legislated racism where they're the beneficiaries of the state. They get jobs, they get welfare, they get looked after in a way that the apartheid state looked after them. There's very little sympathy for them among black South Africans, and wealthier white South Africans look down on them as white trash. And it's not a very well-known story, but it exists. And it was important for me to try and dig out, wherever I went, these images, these stories that try to, challenge people's preconceived notions about a place. And this image here is, I think, one of the stronger ones that does that. We're so used to seeing pictures of white aid workers giving away food or supplies or whatever it is to poor black Africans in whichever corner of the continent you want to choose to describe. And here we have exactly the opposite. We have black South Africans handing out charity to poor white South Africans. So, these kinds of images for me were ones that really did aim to challenge people's notions of what was going on the continent. One of the things on a story like this that is a challenge as a journalist and as a photographer is that some of the people who I was photographing or that I was spending time with in this particular squatter camp, some were very sympathetic and pleasant to talk with. Others held views that I found abhorrent, racist attitudes. And I had to just kind of park any judgment that I might feel. And the most important thing for me as a photographer, and I think in journalism generally, is the ability to empathize with the people who you're photographing or reporting on, and really not to judge and just say, okay, this is a reality that exists. Let me just document it for what it is. And as difficult as that can sometimes be, I think it's important not to be necessarily entirely objective. That is something I'm supposed to be as a newswire photographer. But you need to just allow people to be who they are and just say, I'm going to document this for what it is. One of the other stories that I decided to work on while I was in South Africa ahead of the World Cup was South Africa has one of the highest rates of HIV in the world. And if you think of the typical image that illustrates that notion, it's usually a sort of very skinny or skeletal looking person with sunken eyes in a hospital bed. And that's not an image that I necessarily wanted to perpetuate. So I thought, let me see if there's another way I can approach this story. And what I discovered is that there was an entire generation of parents who had died from HIV. And what that meant is that grandparents were looking after grandchildren. And this struck me as interesting because this is a huge swath of the population. And so I found one of these grandmothers and the grandchildren who she was looking after. And I decided to do a story on the impact of HIV on society without photographing a single person with HIV. So these are people living in the shadow of the disease, but not dying from it. And it's a very short story. I spent an evening and a morning with them. But for me, somebody who is covering a lot of the grimmer aspects of what happens in some of the countries where I worked, it was important to try and show the more nuanced aspect of life in these places as well. The other thing that I used to try to do, again on the same sort of theme, was to show other aspects of life. I lived in Senegal, in Dakar, which is a very vibrant, stylish place. And one of my favorite things every year to photograph is Fashion Week. And again, these are not the kinds of images that people expect to see from West Africa. They expect Liberia, Sierra Leone, war, amputated children, all this kind of thing that sort of feeds the mainstream media machine. But this is going on every day in different places where I would travel and where I would live. And so it was very important to me as a journalist to try and balance my coverage of more negative stories, if you like, with these kinds of images. So yeah, as Alan said, I lived this exciting, adventurous lifestyle, traveling around Africa, making friends wherever I went. I think it was 2007 when I I'd been covering conflicts in Congo and other parts of in Sudan and Chad and other areas, and all of the focus of the wars that America and the coalition were involved in was all on Iraq. But I noticed that there were Canadians fighting in Afghanistan, and this struck me because Canada's we self-identify as a peacekeeping nation. This is kind of what we do. We don't really go out and fight. The last time I think Canadians were involved with frontline fighting was in Korea, sort of 40 years prior to Afghanistan. So I asked Reuters, hey, can I go and sign up with the Canadian troops and see what they're doing over there? And the next thing I knew, I was out on these bases in Kandahar, going on patrols and combat operations with the Canadian forces, who were engaging pretty much daily with the Taliban in these strongholds. And these were the kind of the first time that I'd covered skirmishes, I'd covered conflicts in different places, but this is the first time really that I marched into combat with an army that was intent on engaging an enemy, knowing as you left the base that you were going to be in a firefight in a couple of hours. I found that pretty nerve-wracking, but also pretty exhilarating. I think every time I went out with these guys, you'd leave in the darkness at night and expecting the firefight to begin at dawn. And every time I went out, I said, this is crazy. I'm never going to do this again. And then it would happen, and you get back to the base, and you'd be like, that was pretty fun. And I think, it was Churchill who said there's nothing more exhilarating than getting shot at and missed. And it's pretty true. There's no other buzz quite like it. And so you can feed on this for a while. You can even get a little bit addicted to it. And for me, certainly, I would do these trips, and I'd spend a month or two out on these, fairly remote, not as remote as the one I was with the Marines, but out here, you could spend a long time and have a lot of fun getting pretty dramatic pictures. And there weren't a lot of Canadian photojournalists who were working in Afghanistan at that point. There were some who were doing good work, but I knew that Reuters as a newswire would be able to get all these pictures in the Canadian newspapers, and they did on a pretty regular basis. And a lot of it would be daily stuff like this, nothing going on, guys playing baseball, going on patrols late at night, this kind of thing. Sometimes artillery strikes if they were called in while other people were on various operations. But there's a lot of hanging around in war, a lot of waiting, a lot of boredom. But then, other times you'd find yourself out on a patrol like this that seems pretty basic and routine, and the next thing you know, you're coming under fire from a Taliban ambush. And this is one occasion, I think it was October 23rd, 2008, I think it was, when I was with Canadians and Afghan forces who got ambushed, and it led to this pretty long firefight. And I hunkered down in these sort of ditches while the fighting went on, and tried to remain, out of the line of fire as there was a whole bunch of back and forth and moving around, and just basically trying to stay out of the way of everything that was flying around. And this Canadian sergeant major here he was hiding also behind a wall, and a shell came in from the Taliban side and knocked him to his feet. This picture here ended up on the front page of pretty much every Canadian newspaper, I think, the next day. And I remember hearing later that the Prime Minister called the head of the Canadian military in Kandahar and said, what the hell is going on? What's happening over there? And the military's response was just like, the war is going on. This is happening every day, but it's just on this particular occasion, there was a photographer there who photographed this, and it really wasn't anything different from. Well, I think I checked, and that month there had been, and it was like 2/3 of the way through the month, there had been 23 such little firefights like this. So it really wasn't out of the ordinary, but there just wasn't a lot of coverage of this kind of stuff. So that was right after that ambush. So you get all these kind of violent, dramatic images, but the wires can get pretty tied up with that kind of thing. So I would also try and take a step back and do things that were a little quieter, a little different, to put on the wire, like this kind of stuff. This was Taliban Graffiti that I found in a regional, there's a sort of district center, they're called, where the local governor would be based, or the British would be based, or then it would turn over to the Americans or whoever was in control. And at one point, the Taliban had held it, so they'd put all this kind of interesting graffiti. And this, to me, was in some way a kind of forensic document of all the different, because in this base, I don't have them here, but in this base, the Americans had put up their own graffiti as well, which is a totally different style, you can imagine. Looked like tattoo kind of art. So you had all these different styles of graffiti. So yeah, back up to TJ and his Marines in Afghanistan. I showed you the video. You see all the drama of the firefights that we would get in there. But again, I would try to temper those with kind of side little stories that I would do. And I would go out on patrol with them. And the second time I went back with his guys, there wasn't really much going on. It had been winter. The Taliban had kind of filtered back into Pakistan. They relied on IEDs more than they were relying on ambushes at that point. So I started taking photographs of doors, of all these Afghan doors that we would pass on patrol. And I kind of became a little bit obsessed with it. And the Marines at first were like, what the hell are you doing taking pictures of all these doors? And then I showed them what I was doing, and they're like, oh, that's pretty cool. All right, that's interesting. And then they started saying, oh, hey, look, there's an interesting door over there. You guys want to go take a picture of that door? And I just kept saying, no, 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 just don't. I don't want somebody to step on something over there that could blow them up or blow me up or something might happen. So it was really a weird thing where I made the mistake of telling them about it, but I didn't really want them to start chasing this idea of let's go find some doors, because I didn't want to have to live with the idea of anything happening. But again, it's one of these things like the graffiti and a couple of stories that I'll show you a little bit later. I wanted to just show more than the machinery and the muscle of war, and just show these other quieter moments. And in a way, all these closed doors to me kind of symbolize this idea that the foreign forces are not welcome here. I'm not welcome there. I'll never really understand or know what's happening behind these doors. And it was a reminder of the frustration that I felt being contained within a military context. I could never photograph Afghanis. I could never photograph really what this country was like. Fortunately, I was part of a bigger organization that had Afghan photographers who could cover that part of the story, and my job was really just to show the slice of the war that I could see as an embedded photographer. But it was frustrating when you want to feel like you're telling a complete story, to only be able to get that small window that I got through the military. So this is, in a way, was like my little symbolic effort to kind of mark that in a way. And I found the same thing. So the second time I left TJ and his squad up at OP Kunjak, they had a couple weeks left in their deployment. I was heading to Libya, where the Arab Spring had spilled from Tunisia, which I'd covered, to Egypt, which I hadn't covered because I was back in Afghanistan. And I went to Libya and spent the whole, couple of weeks running up and down the front lines and with the rebels until they would get shot at. It was just chaos and lots of dramatic pictures and lots of violence and guys with guns and that kind of thing. So again, the wires at this point had been filled with angry Arabs shouting and fighting and stuff. So I just thought, let me try and find something. I mean, I had to file some of those kinds of pictures too. But again, I went looking for something that offered the wires and our magazine clients and our newspaper clients something different. So I did this sort of still life of the wreckage and the ruins along the road of war, along Revolution Road. This is like a ribbon of road that connected the northern coastline from the rebel areas to the government-controlled areas. And basically, this was the line that the front line moved up and down this road based on who was advancing and who was retreating. And everybody was trying to get control of the oil reserves that were, somewhere along this road. And again, I decided, aside from all the violent action images it was always important for me to try and get a sense of the people in the places where I was, and it was very difficult to do that. And I tried to do it through a series of portraits with some young rebel fighters who I met, and trying to find their names, a little bit about them, their ages. These are all like entrepreneurs or students or English teachers and that kind of thing, and they'd all taken up arms. This is what happened, even though they had no military experience. And I wanted to get to know them. I thought maybe I'll follow some of these guys around. But as I photographed them, a local commander came up and accused me of being a spy and detained me and my fixer. And it kind of ended this little project that I hoped to develop on some way. But again, this was a series that sort of took us behind the front lines, behind the action, and a little bit more of a feature-y kind of story that gave a little bit of insight into these guys, their names, their hopes and aspirations for what the revolution was to them. So while I was in Libya as well, I was working with my friend Tim Hetherington. He was later killed about 3 weeks after this picture was taken in Misrata, another city in Libya, by a rocket that came in and killed him and another photographer friend of ours, Chris Hondros. And I think that was for me a turning point where I'd been covering conflict pretty much nonstop for 2 years at this point, and I was feeling pretty burnt out. And their deaths shook our community of conflict journalists. And up until then, I'd always sort of thought, well, what I'm doing is my choice. If something happens, I've made that decision. But what I discovered was that when they died, the impact that it had on their friends and their family was devastating. And I started to think in a way that maybe what I'm doing is this adventurous, interesting lifestyle. It's a bit selfish, and it had cost me relationships. It meant that when I was coming home, I was emotionally numb or exhausted from the places that I'd been, and I couldn't engage in the same way that I had done in the past with those I cared about or who cared about me. And I felt very removed from the world, like I was sort of living on the sidelines, watching it go by. I got quite depressed about a lot of things, and the only way that I could kind of get amped up again was to go back to these kinds of places and resume this kind of work, and it just sort of kept going and kept going. And what I discovered after a while was that this adventure that had become this career that had become my lifestyle was really amounting to a collection of other people's misery and death, and what I was doing didn't seem to be making much of a difference. And I took a sabbatical year off to study trauma and psychology, and that gave me a certain amount of perspective and distance from it. But when I went back to work, I was posted to Israel, and I thought, okay, maybe this will be a little bit easier to live here. This will be, not as hard in terms of the logistics of traveling in West Africa. And I thought, okay, let's give that a try. Maybe it'll be okay. But then I got there, and I discovered it was quite a hostile place in its own way. And as it turned out, a series of events led to the 2014 summer war in Gaza. And I found myself going in there, even though I had kind of in my mind decided I no longer wanted to cover this kind of stuff. I was now part of a team that expected me to pull my weight. Of our team of photographers there, I was the only foreigner with a foreign passport. So my Israeli colleagues could not obviously go into Gaza, and my Palestinian colleagues in Gaza couldn't go out. So they were limited in their movement. I was the only one who could cover the war from both sides for our news agency. So I went in to support our Palestinian photographers there. And while I was there, I ended up working alongside all the other local photographers and foreign photographers who were covering this conflict. And what I ended up feeling was just that I was taking the same kinds of pictures as everybody around me. And all these pictures to me looked pretty much like the pictures from the previous conflict in Gaza, and the one before that, and the one before that. So blown up buildings, grieving relatives, dead children, injured children. And we're talking dozens a day, hundreds a week. And that's disturbing enough on its own, but feeling like your work is not doing anything is pretty demoralizing, to say the least. It kind of led to a crisis of conscience for me, where I decided, as important as this stuff is to document, I just didn't want to do it anymore.